Hello and welcome to Badger Talks Live, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Haley Laubscher, originally from Stillwater, Minnesota. I'm a rising senior in the School of Business, studying marketing and international business. I'm pleased to introduce UW-Madison Department of History Ph.D. candidate Leslie Bellais. Today, she will be talking about women's fashionable attire in the Victorian period and how their unique undergarments shaped those looks. Leslie served as the Curator of Costume and Textiles at the Wisconsin Historical Society for 29 years before retiring. She turned her interest in women's Victorian underwear into an academic pursuit when she researched and wrote her master's thesis, Bringing Up the Rear, which focused on the history and significance of late 19th century bustles. Please welcome Leslie Bellais.
Thank you. So thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to be talking about essentially Victorian women's underwear. And I wanted to kind of clarify two terms first. One is Victorian, just so we know we're talking about Queen Victoria's reign. That's 1837 to 1901. So that's the time period I'm going to be focusing on. I also want to talk about underwear being a concept that's relatively new in history. It's basically we're talking about clothes that are worn under your outer clothes and are not meant to be seen by the general public. So just so we have those two terms clear, and also Victorian underwear is uniquely special because it's the time frame where women are wearing more underwear than they ever wore before or since. And so I think it's a very unique time period to kind of look and study women's underwear. I believe they're probably wearing this amount of underwear because of middle class values such as respectability and modesty that are at their peak at this particular time. And also because Victorians love the idea of having a lot, of having too much, of being extravagant in everything in their lives, including, it turns out, clothing and underwear. So before we go into Victorian underwear, I want to make sure you understand what came before. Underwear for men seems to have existed at least as far back as ancient times, and that's Greek and Roman ancient times. And that's probably because men have dangly bits that need to be protected and controlled, while women don't. So you don't really see women's underwear appear until around the 13th century, when very wealthy women start wearing a layer of clothing underneath their dress, kind of like a slip today, a full-length slip that protected the clothes from the body. Only wealthy women wore this garment, and we don't see women wearing underwear at all classes and all social levels really until the late 17th and into the 18th century. So I am going to start there. For some reason, there we go, whoops. So we're going to look at the 18th century for a moment here. What's going on in the 18th century is women are wearing a shift, which is kind of a slip, a stays, which is sort of an early version of the corset, pockets possibly underneath their clothes, and panniers, which are side hoops if they are well-to-do women. What happens as more women are wearing in the 18th century, as more women are wearing underclothes, is that there's an awareness that these clothes, which are not seen but are worn next to the body, are they become eroticized. And it's very clear in this time period because of images like the one you're seeing here on the right, where a woman's stocking leg is shown off, which is considered quite erotic at the time. And you'll see this kind of image of a woman exposing her calf over and over again in 18th century illustration and art like this one. We know that this was eroticized not just because of these images, but because of statements like Samuel Johnson, who wrote later on that, who spoke later on that he would go he went backstage at a play and had to leave abruptly because after seeing women's stocking legs, he had, as he said at the time, quote, he had an unfortunate physical reaction and had to leave quickly. So we know that this was eroticized and that stockings are the first piece of clothing to be considered like this. The other thing I want to point out about underwear, especially pre-Victorian era, is that there's nothing else underneath the dress except maybe a petticoat, though they weren't wearing that many under petticoats at that time. So this image on the left, you're seeing here, this is what it looks like when a woman pulled up her dress. She had nothing underneath. So if she lifts up her skirt, it's like what I would call a free shot. So I want you to keep that in mind as we move forward. This image that you're seeing on the left is sort of a soft porn image. We know that because she's exposed. She's actually on what we would call the toilet, and there's a gentleman looking at her. That male gaze often refers to pornography, even if we can't recognize it as such. Though I think this is pretty obvious. So the thing is that men are wearing what they would call bifurcated garments. That's pants, breeches, in something that covers the crotch area. Women are not, and that's what differentiates women's clothes from men's clothes. As we move into the Victorian era, one of the things I want to talk about first is what goes over this underwear, so you understand what is underneath it, what the clothing underneath it is doing to the outer look. Now, when I think of Victorian clothing, it's sort of bookended by two eras where the look is what I would call columnar, like a column. The dress hangs from the shoulders and just goes straight down to the ankle or the floor. So that if you think of the Jane Austen look, if you've seen any Jane Austen movies, you know that it's a straight dress, it's an empire waist just below the bust, but it just hangs straight. At the other end, in the late Edwardian era, we see another columnar look that hangs from the shoulders and goes straight to the floor. You might think of the Titanic. If you've seen that, I used to call it the Titanic look, but now you might call it Downton Abbey season 1. It's that kind of just straight look. There's no lumps or bumps to the dress. In the Victorian era, the way I kind of describe that look is that there's usually a bubble of air on the body somewhere in the clothing. As Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, that bubble of air was at the upper sleeve. It moved to the lower sleeve later on. And as we move into the 1840s, where she really comes into her own as queen, what happens is the sleeve becomes long and narrow and the skirt starts expanding. So here it is in the 1840s with just a number of petticoats underneath, holding out the fullness. The idea is to have a domed skirt, so that's full in the front and back and sides as well. What happens is in the late 1850s, we add a hoop skirt. And I should mention this bubble of air usually starts kind of on the smaller side and then grows to a ridiculous proportion until it becomes so ridiculous that it collapses and the bubble of air appears somewhere else. So in the 1850s, to kind of grow the skirt, the hoop underskirt, the hoop skirt that goes underneath this dress is invented. In the 1850s, the hoop is round with the woman standing in the center. By the 1860s, we have this oval skirt with the woman standing towards the front. So that collapses very suddenly in 1868, mainly due to the political situation in France. But if you notice here, the woman standing in the front with the fullness to the back, that will return very quickly as the first bustle era. And here we see that fullness around, this is probably, I think, an 1873 image. So here it is with the new bubble of air off the backside. The thing to keep in mind here is that it's very short-waisted look in the 1870s with a nice rounded top, like you have a bird cage underneath there at your back. Otherwise, the skirt more or less hangs straight down to the floor. Now this will expand up to, it'll reach its largest proportion around 1873 with about a 2-foot projection at its largest. Now you're only going to wear your largest projection in an evening or dinner gown. During the day, you'll wear something smaller. So after 1873, the bustle starts collapsing. It collapses rather slowly, but by 1880, you have this look, which is one of the few times where there is no bubble of air on the body, but the dress becomes another extreme, which is so tight that it's almost a hobble skirt and it's difficult to walk in. So the bodice becomes skin tight. And what happens is the corset at this time doesn't need to be very tight. It doesn't need to be very long because of the way the waist is handled there. But with 1880, it has to become very long because the hips are showing. With the hips showing, you need to pull in the bustle, not the bustle, you need to pull in the corset tighter to get more differentiation between the waist and the hips. So it really will change the look of the corset. Now this look does not last very long, and it's almost like, well, we might as well just have the bubble of era pop out where it did before. So the second bustle era begins around 1883. And this is the look here. So you notice now we have that really tight upper bodice continue. So it's very long waisted. And we have a flat topped bustle. So you could carry a tea tray on the back of there if you wanted. Again, it can get up to about a 2-foot projection. That usually happens around 1887, 1888. And it will collapse around 1889. And as it disappears, there's another bubble of air will appear, and that bubble of air is the sleeve right here. It starts out rather small and will grow to these ridiculous proportions you're seeing around 1895, 96. So this is the hourglass look that people often talk to when they refer of the Victorian era. So here it is, large on the top with a little tiny waist continuing from the 1880s, but now we have a cone-shaped skirt, so a gored skirt being worn below. So this corset gets challenged, and a new corset is invented in 1898 and worn to about 1909, 1908, 1909. And what it does though is it prevents the body from standing straight up like you're seeing here. It forces the body into this sort of reverse S curve with the butt sticking out and the bosom sticking out. And this area right here is also, it's the last bubble of air. This is all filled out with fabric, usually ruffles, to make that bubble of air stick out and create this powder pigeon or bird-chested look that you're seeing there. So this image is actually 1905. Queen Victoria died in 1901. But this look was established in 1898. And so it is considered part of the Victorian era, though this look is generally considered Edwardian. Now, underneath all these clothes, you're going to wear at least some of these garments. So you're going to begin by putting on a chemise, which is kind of a loose slip that hangs to your knees. You might wear drawers. You're definitely going to wear a corset. Starting around the 1860s, you're going to wear a corset cover, which goes over the corset and prevents that harsh line you might get from right here, especially on the back from your corset, and it kind of softens it. It also protects the clothes from the corset because of the harsh lines. You're definitely going to wear petticoats under all of this, usually more than one, generally at least two, but in the dome skirt era of the 1840s, it could go up to 4 or 6. So those are, by the end of the century, you're wearing all of these clothes. Throughout the century, you might wear 1 or 2 of these, one being the hoop, the bustle, or a bust improver. Now, I'm not going to go over all of these because I have a limited amount of time. Instead, I'm going to focus on the garments that are quintessentially Victorian. I'm going to begin with the corset. So the corset here that you're seeing here is an 1830s corset. We know that because they're wearing a big sleeve even in the chemise, which is sort of the thing at the time. So this is mid to late 1830s. So she has her chemise on, she wears her corset over it. And you'll notice that the corset, well, it's maybe not so obvious, but the corset at this time period is not heavily boned. You'll have a busk, which is a centerpiece down the front that's hard, that usually slips in and out so that you can wash your corset. There might be a bone or two here and along the sides. But the idea at this point is not to have a super small waist. The idea is to have an erect posture, an aristocratic posture. And the corsets help do that at this point. So that is essentially what you're seeing here. And this is the kind of corset that's worn until the late 70s, around 1880. It gets shorter through the 50s, 60s, and 70s with that short-waisted look. It does not need to go over the hips. But generally, despite Scarlett O'Hara and Gone with the Wind and her need for a 17-inch waist, that is generally not what is being worn at this point. That'll change, as I said, in 1880 when corsets become much tighter. And here is another kind of soft porn image from this time. This is a stereo opticon slide. And if you can tell, she is wearing a fully boned corset that gives her the hourglass shape that you can see in the mirror. The difference now is that there's still a busk down the center, but it clasps in the front so she can put it on and off by herself. You'll notice that it laces down the back, but the actual lacing is centered at the waist. And this is done on purpose so that she can pull it tight. To get it super tight, she needs a friend like this guy who's, you're a peach, he's her peach. And he can pull it in even tighter with this extra effort on his part. Now, an average woman of an average figure can generally pull in about 4 inches of flesh around her middle with a heavily boned corset like you're seeing here. Now, corsets do a number of things to the body. One of them is that they raise the bosom up. The way I kind of think about it is that there are little gussets under each bosom, kind of triangular pieces, that when when I look at it, it looks to me like an ice cream cone that you have filled with bosom. So it holds the bosom up high, and that's often how you can tell if a corset's being worn or not, because it holds the bosom up in a place that's not necessarily natural to the body. And if you're a large woman, it should almost come underneath your chin, as you can see with this woman who is kindly placed teacups on her bosom to show how well her corset is holding, among other things, how well her corset is holding up her bosom. Now, this woman, I found out after I discovered this image, did work for a carnival or circus as the fat lady for that circus. And so being photographed like this would be something that might be appropriate for her, but not for most women at that time. Just so we understand her, she is wearing a corset, and this is a ball gown that's on top of it. So, but you do get a sense, I hope, at least a little bit of what a corset can do to the bosom. However, when most people think of these late 19th century corsets, they think of what it does to the waist, and that is this need at the time to make it smaller, at least in proportion to the hips. And they were quite aware of that at the time. This is a 1890s French cartoon. And you can see again, here's the gentleman with his foot on her bottom, pulling it as tight as possible, along with the help of what is probably her maid. And it pulls it so tight that she cracks in half and falls apart. So we do know now, there's a lot of talk at the time about health concerns due to wearing corsets. However, we know now that at least no one died from wearing a corset. It does rearrange your body to a certain extent so that there are issues, but it won't, it makes it sometimes hard to breathe so that you're breathing from your upper chest rather than from deep, being able to take a deep breath, which can make you faint, and why fainting couches were the thing, but it won't actually kill you. So but they did worry about that at the time. And so you're going to, so in 1898, a new corset was invented, and it was called the health corset because of supposedly its health benefits in that it did not pull in the abdomen, pulls in at the sides and well, you can see here, pulls in at the sides, but not at the front. So your abdomen, where all your internal organs are not being pulled in. And supposedly this is healthier. However, what it does do is it's flat fronted and long. So it goes down long over your hip bones, and hip bones actually project forward a little bit. So when it comes down flat over your hip bones, it forces your backside out. And so here we're getting kind of an exaggerated backside. And when it forces your backside out, that kind of thrusts your bosom forward. And that's where you get this kind of S curve that they talk about from that time period, or swan shape, as they like to say. Now, we know today because of research done by historians who, especially one who was a nurse and a costume historian. She put a number of women through treadmill tests and other kind of tests in health corset versus an earlier 19th century corset, and found that this corset is actually less healthy for your body than the regular corset, mainly because of what it does to your back here and the stress it puts on having your back arched like that. At the time, however, they thought it was healthier. And just to show you what a corset does to the body, this is a image of a woman X-ray. X-rays were new and relatively new in 1908, and a doctor in England had the idea of X-raying women in their corsets. All the stays are and the tie, the lacing up the back was done in metal so that those would stand out. But it does show you what it does to a female body if you wear a corset over time. It won't happen from wearing one corset. So this is a relatively healthy body. You can see the rib cage in its healthy position. This is wearing a corset for most of your life. And what it does is pull in the lower ribs. If you might remember, ribs and the lower ribs are not attached to your sternum. So they kind of hang free in the body. And over time, they can be pushed forward. No one got their ribs removed at this time. That's sort of a myth that people hear. Because it's not necessary because of this ability to move the ribs in. Now, the idea at the time was to show a hourglass corset versus a health corset, but this is sort of this is not quite a true image in that the doctor later admitted that the woman who's wearing the health corset was a French peasant woman who had never been corseted in her life. So we're really comparing a healthy uncorseted body to a corseted body over time. But the idea was to show that it didn't pull in the rib cage, at least. So that's corsets. I'd like to move on to another new item that's introduced. Well, I will say corsets weren't new. Stays existed beforehand. They did a different task in that they created a conical shape to your body instead of an hourglass shape. But hoops, this hoop is invented in the 1850s. Now hoops, some sort existed beforehand. Panniers or side hoops were worn in the 18th century, but they were fabric constructions with pockets for boning in them to help create the bone shape, the necessary shape. Hoops in the 1850s and into the 1860s are usually these open framed looks made out of wire, in this case, with twill tape attached to all of them to help hold them together. So what this lightweight construction does is allow these hoops to get quite large. The hoop on this side is not wire. It's made from pneumatic tubes, kind of like you'd have on your bicycle wheel, and you blow them up when you're ready to use them. So she's got a pneumatic tube hoop held together with twill tape. You'll notice this is the 1850s with the woman standing in the center of a dome-shaped hoop. Now, like I mentioned before with that bubble of air, hoops could get very large. And this is probably the most extreme size you're going to get. Most hoops average at this time between 4 to 6 feet in diameter. This is probably a 10 to 12 foot one. It is pneumatic. The contraption to blow it up is right here in the lower right corner. Now these two images are a series of stereopticons. We're not quite sure why they were made, if they're showing, if they're making fun of the hoop or if they're showing an actual woman who's about to get dressed and go out in this hoop. But anyway, you can get a sense of the large size that is possible with hoops. You'll notice that she's wearing a petticoat over a hoop. You never went out with a petticoat. You never went out with a hoop that did not have a petticoat over it because you did not want to see those hoop rings. That was considered rather gauche. You can also tell from this image that wearing this size prevented a lot of people from being in the room. And so it's a bit of a difficult thing to maneuver in. Now, hoops did have an issue that hadn't existed before with other types of underwear, and it led to a new type of underclothing being worn by women. So with hoops, you can see the issue in this image on the left especially. This woman has caught her hoop on the door frame of a carriage and has essentially done a face plant. She, like most women at the time, was wearing nothing underneath. And so this gentleman is kind of giggling because he's got kind of a free shot here. up her, it's not a straight shot up her skirt. So women began to worry about the modesty of these kind of issues. That also occurred, as you can see on the images in the center and the left, and under a strong wind, the wind could either take the dress straight up, like you're seeing here, with the hoop left exposed. This is supposed to be, this is supposed to be a new flower type that is been seen recently on the seaside, new delicate annual. Recently seen at the seaside, but you can also see in this image on in the lower right that the hoop and the skirt could go over together as well. So what we begin to see is the introduction of women wearing drawers. And this woman is wearing drawers. I believe this woman possibly is wearing drawers, since you can see her chemise line right there. This woman is not wearing drawers. So drawers have been around. They are a male undergarment, worn at least since around the 17th century, but definitely through the 18th century. They're called drawers because you draw them onto your body, and they were what men wore underneath their breeches or pants. When women start wearing them, it's very controversial for women to be wearing a bifurcated garment underneath her, even though it's not seen and underneath her dress. And there are records of this being spoken out against, mainly by conservative women's magazines and conservative ministers. What we do know is that starting in around the turn of the century, 1800, little girls were wearing pantalettes and tunics in a way, or a tunic dress, as children were being dressed alike. Boys and girls were being dressed alike. And so girls wore pantalettes and boys wore sort of a dress type in combination. As they grew up, they were supposed to give up their pantalettes. But this generation chose not to. This younger generation chose not to, as they came of age during the hoop era. So older women may not have always worn drawers, but younger women took them up fairly quickly. This is what drawers looked like at the time. This is another soft porn image. It's called The Fencer. She seems to be stabbing herself in the heart or something. But anyway, she's not wearing a chemise underneath her corset. She's wearing her corset directly on her body, which was not considered the norm, and is showing this image to be different. But this is what drawers look like for most of the century. They are knee length, they're plain, they're unadorned. The thing to keep in mind about drawers is that because they were so controversial, the way to differentiate women's drawers from men's drawers was to have them open crotch. If you remember, women did not have anything underneath their clothes for most of the century. And one historian has argued that keeping them open crotch has maintained the feminism, the feminist qualities, the feminine qualities of drawers during this time period. These are open crotch so you can't tell. They're usually so baggy through the hips that it's very easy to hide the open crotch quality of drawers. This is a corset ad from the turn of the century, and you can see drawers have shortened and gotten frillier. The concept at this time, especially starting in the 1890s into the 1900s, is that special someone, assuming to be your husband, will see your underwear. And so having this kind of practical plain underwear is sort of unattractive, and that maybe having frilly, pretty underwear makes more sense. And it's also, as you'll also see that underwear at this time will become even more eroticized than ever before. And that will show up especially in advertisements for underwear like this one you're seeing here. I'd next like to talk about bustles. As Haley mentioned, I wrote my master's thesis on the history of bustles, history and significance of bustles from this time, from the 19th century. I do want to point out that bustles have been worn before, including the second quarter of the 19th century, but they were worn for a different reason. As we're coming out of that kind of Jane Austen look, this is a little short for a Jane Austen dress, but that's the way the artist drew it. That dress that hung from the shoulders down to the ankles. We're moving into that dome-shaped dress starting around 1829, but it'll really come to its own in the 1830s. Now, to get that dome shape, you have a problem, because normally at the small of your back, the dress falls in, and they called it a falling in at the back, and they thought it was unattractive. The way to kind of fill out that falling in was to wear a crescent-shaped bustle like you're seeing here in the 1829, 1830 era. And then in the late 1850s, we start seeing patents for them, and we start seeing them being mass manufactured like this one. So this is could be worn with a hoop. The hoop usually doesn't have a built-in bustle, so this will help maintain that dome shape in the back that is so required at the time. However, when people think of bustles, they mainly think of this time period, the two bustle eras, the 1870s and the 1880s. And I kind of want to point out the difference in bustles from this time period. If you look at the three bustles from the 1870s, the one thing they all have in common is that they're made out of fabric. This is crinoline up here. Crinoline is woven horsehair. It creates a stiff kind of fabric like buckram, and is fairly decent at holding out your skirts. This is what's normally called the lobster tail bustle, as it shows up around 1874, 1875 as the bustle's collapsing. It's knee length, and it's got these pockets for boning in it that helps hold out the skirt and helps it create a nice train down to the floor. This, however, is how most bustles look at this time period, just a nice kind of beehive shaped with boning in it. And this is a cartoon from 1874. You can see it says building the ship. She's rigging up. So those are the 1870s bustles. They're generally made by women using fabric, and they might be made by the woman who's wearing them, by her dressmaker, or by another woman who is just making bustles for the trade. However, generally they're not mass manufactured, and they're generally not patented. That changes as we come back into the bustle era in the 1880s. And in the bustle era of the 1880s, what we find is that men step in to create new and improved bustles, taking care of a lot of the problems that existed with these, in that they tended to be heavy, causing a woman often to sweat down her back, which was considered an issue. And they made it difficult to sit down. In fact, if you sat in this bustle, your bustle is sitting on most of the chair while you're sitting perched on the edge. So here we're seeing a bustle made, mass manufactured by and designed by men. Men seem to prefer to work in metal rather than fabric. So this one is collapsible. When you sat down, you folded it up towards the body, and when you stood up, it flipped back into shape and you're ready to go. This one down here is called a pendant spring bustle. It's made with coils, spring coils, which were invented just a few decades before and often showed up in mattresses and furniture. And these little bits, leftover bits, could easily be made into a bustle. But just to show you that men didn't quite understand the purpose of bustles, here you can see that there's a lot of air underneath the bustle, and it's actually sticking the woman's body, making the woman's body stick out. Well, here, this woman, and this was definitely drawn by a man because he did not understand it. She seems to already have the natural bustle projection in her body. The bustle is not doing anything for her. And it's just kind of a confusing image to me. This is actually mass manufactured, but it's made with fabric and down, which is sort of an unusual version of a male produced bustle. So I just want to end with one last piece of underclothing, and that's the bust improver. Now, you mainly see it in the late 19th century. Most women are not wearing bust improvers before then. They tend to look like this. This one is woven wire, and then it's got covered with fabric, and it's pinned to the front of the corset to give yourself a bosom. I also want to point out, as we move into that S-curve shape, when bust improvers are mainly worn, you might possibly need to wear a small flat bustle to help kind of fill out that shape, to give that nice round bottom that's required in case you don't have it. So flat bustles are the thing for the late 19th century into the early 20th. However, these other two are pneumatic in that you blew them up. And then when you're done with them, you let the air out and you put them in the drawer. And you can see here what a woman might look like before she's put on a bust improver. This company is not only selling a bust improver, it's also selling hip forms and bustles, so that here she is in her skinny kind of ectomorph body without a whole lot going on, no curves that were necessary from that time period. And here she's all nicely filled out in the ideal figure of that time. The other thing we're seeing here, as I mentioned before, is sort of the eroticism of this underwear, and that this is sort of a sexy pose. You do not see women actually in underwear ads until the late 1890s into the 20th century. And this is also considered a sexy pose. In case you can't tell, this is the before and this is the after. So she has got a nice full bosom with her bust form. So the question is, why would a woman at this time period wear all these clothes? And I think a true story of Madame Warren and her corset kind of helps tell that story. Here helps tell us why. Here's a woman wearing a bustle dress from 1886, but she doesn't have the right figure up top. She's probably wearing a corset from before the 1880 time period, which is not heavily boned. It's not holding up her bosom in the way that late 19th century corsets do. But she acquires a Madame Warren corset, and now all of a sudden she has a nice waist and a nice bosom. She puts on the same clothes and goes out into public. There it is with her nice form, ideal shape, just like you would expect, being checked out by all the guys. And then I think this guy right here ends up marrying her, still wearing Madame Warren's corset. The question in my mind became, what happens when this guy finds out she actually looks more like that? And they did talk about that at the time. And here you're seeing a centerfold image from a French men's magazine from 1882. And here's that same woman, or same type of woman, that kind of ectomorph frame. She's all padded out here and has this nice figure when she goes out in public. So this is before and after the corset, is what this is called. Here's a kind of a fleshier woman. She's, instead of wearing padding, she's using the corset to control all that flesh and to give it a nice shape. And here she is out in public with her clothes on. So these looks are exactly the same, but they are using underwear, whether it's the kind of tight lacing or whether it's padding that does this. And I should have mentioned earlier that women of all social classes are wearing corsets at this time period. I would think of it as like wearing a bra today, or at least kind of pre-pandemic wearing a bra, where, you know, most women, with very few exceptions, go out in public with a bra on. And that is true in the 19th century. Very few women are going out without a corset on. They're not pulling it particularly tight because they want to breathe, but they do want to be respectable. And if you think of the term straight-laced means you're laced into your corset. You're straight-laced means you're respectable, that you are modest, that you're doing all the right things. If you don't have your corset on, you're hanging loose. Your bosom and your flesh are hanging loose. And so you're a loose woman and you're not respectable. So having a corset on is very important for most women to have, to at least have a claim to respectability. And even if they're in the lower classes, they have aspirational, often have aspirations for a higher class, or to be viewed as being a higher class, not necessarily the top class, but a higher class than they actually are. When it comes to it in the end, though, most women are wearing the underclothes for the same reason possibly Mary Jane is here. This is Mary Jane before and after visiting New York. Mary Jane is obviously a hick from the outside world, and she is from the countryside, is what I meant to say. And so as she comes to New York, she's wearing the right outer clothes. But she obviously does not have a corset on. This is 1874. She should have some bustle, and she doesn't even have a petticoat on because you can see her leg, which was considered rather gauche to be able to be aware of women's legs. When she gets to New York, she starts putting on the right underwear. She has her corset on, she has a bustle on, she has her petticoats. There's no concept of legs anymore. And as she's done that, she's also done her hair nicely. She's got her hat at a jaunty angle. She's even got her umbrella nicely rolled and her dog dressed. And you'll notice the difference here. Men are not paying attention. Men are paying attention. So the way I kind of think of it is women in the 19th century generally did not think of comfort the same way we do. Comfort being like in your sweatpants and your sweatshirt hanging around your house where you're physically comfortable. Women did not think about being physically comfortable in their clothes. What they thought about was being comfortable in public and being seen as dressed appropriately. When you're dressed appropriately, you are comfortable in your clothes. Mary Jane here is not dressed appropriately. She is not comfortable in her clothes, though she does look more comfortable there than she does here physically. Also, she's got this Grecian bend going on, which is really big in the 1874 era. So she's even kind of thrust her chest forward a bit and given herself kind of that uncomfortable look there. So I hope that answers a lot of questions, or at least brings up some about women's underwear in the Victorian era. This is sort of a quick and dirty version of underwear in this time period. And I look forward to some questions.
Leslie, thank you so much. And I'm still sort of analyzing this last image that you put out there. And I don't know, in my mind, the woman who is all bustled up looks more unhappy. Is that just
well, they're both frowning.
Yeah.
So
and the dog is slumping.
She's looking aloof. She's looking aloof and elegant is what she's going for there.
Oh my goodness. Well, hello everybody. Fran Paleo-Moyer, Badger Talks Live producer. What an entertaining talk. Thank you so much for that. We do have a few posts here in the comments. So Vivian Wiley Speakman posts, my mother and grandmother both wore corsets through the years of 80s. So I don't know if that means the 1980s or both into their 80s, I'm envisioning is what she probably means. So, you know, that's probably fairly recent that some of these women continued to wear corsets throughout their lives. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. The thing to keep in mind with corsets, I'm going to go back to an image of a corseted woman, like this corseted woman here. When you wear a corset for most of your life, what happens is that the corset starts acting for your back muscles. So when 1920-ish, World War I, 1920 came around and corsets were thrown to the side, young women could do that. They had not lived their whole life in corsets. For women who were older, who had lived in corsets through at least into their 30s, they found that going without a corset was extremely uncomfortable. They had trouble sort of even standing and sitting. So what we see is that corsets are sold, at least into boned corsets are sold through the 1940s. They're going to be replaced by girdles to a certain extent. But boned corsets for these women who were of age in the 19th century into the early 20th century have to be available for women into at least the 1940s, maybe trickling into the 50s. But I saw them in Sears catalogs through about the 1940s. Okay, so that's why you're going to see, if she's talking about women into their 80s, I don't know about the 1980s, but women into their 80s from this time period wearing corsets, there's a reason for that.
I see. Yeah, that would make complete sense that your muscles wouldn't have been developed then as a result. Karen Kuba posted, Leona Forrester of La Crosse, Wisconsin, I'm assuming, formed her own garment company to manufacture a 3-in-1 garment, a corset, cover, drawers, and skirt. She opened her own shop in 1895 when she was 16. Are you familiar with this shop by chance?
No, I'm not, but I didn't. That's one of the things I left out. I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning here and show you this image. When we start getting clothes like this, you start needing to combine underwear to a sleeker form. And that is what she's talking about. So that the corset cover and petticoat become one garment, one long garment with no seams at the waist to kind of break up that nice line there, or they become a corset cover drawers combination, which is usually called combinations. And again, it's to help with this kind of long lined look that you have here. They continue to be worn into the 20th century. So my guess is that if she's making clothes like that, she's making them starting in the 80s or 90s, possibly into the zeros. By the 19-teens, they really are kind of disappearing.
And forgive me, in the beginning, I'm rushing to get different tech things sorted with these talks. So if I missed this, forgive me, but pre-1800s, like even going back to maybe medieval times? Like, is there a history of this, or was it really like just in this era?
That's kind of what I talked about, is that you start seeing women's underwear in the Middle Ages. It's only worn by the very wealthy. You don't really see women at all classes wearing underwear until about the late 17th into the 18th centuries, where it becomes kind of the norm.
Ashley Thompson is asking, at what age did girls start wearing corsets?
Well, it's a little hard to say in that what are you defining as a corset? Starting around 2 years old, you're going to start seeing boys and girls being put into a tailored garment that's sort of corset-like, or corset light, is whatever you want to put it. And that is to help, oh dear, there's my cat there. That is to help kind of train the body into having that correct figure. You start boning corsets for girls when they hit puberty.
Okay. And Cynthia Hoffland is asking, some women wore split skirt dresses. Did they wear corsets?
Like I said before, almost every woman who wants to be considered respectable is going to wear a corset. Slit skirts come in the mid 1890s, when bicycles for women are invented. That is when the rail for the bicycle drops and you can wear a skirted garment with them. However, skirts tended to get caught in the back wheel. So they were constantly, I have a whole nother talk on bicycle clothing in the
We'll have to have you back for that one. That sounds
really
really
interesting.
interesting.
Riding a bike in the 1890s became a big deal. So you started wearing a split skirt. You might be a skirt that you could cover up as being split when you got off the bike. But having a split skirt is not going to change whether you wear a corset or not. In fact, I found images of women playing basketball in their corsets. And they're obviously having you can see the corset line. You know, it's not just their corsets, but they have their gym clothes and their corset on. So, you know, and the thing is, you also have to remember there are corsets for sport, there are corsets for nursing, there are corsets with different for different activities. So not every corset in the 1890s is going to be the super tight one, but you are going to have something on that is corset-like.
Okay, some really interesting questions coming in here in the chat. So Melissa Radke and Marion Blakely are asking sort of similar questions. So without underpants, so to speak, how did women take care of their monthly sanitary needs? And did ladies' pantaloons also have a split crotch, or how did they handle going to the bathroom?
I get that question all the time. And if I was doing this talk live, I would have, and wasn't on a time frame, I probably would have gone over what happens at that time of the month. But the thing is, they're probably going, if you do have your period, you're probably going to wear a belt with a rag attached to the front and the back that goes under your crotch. It's not going to be attached to your clothes, obviously, because your clothes are open crotch. I should mention that open crotch seems to end around 1900s. In the collections of the Wisconsin Historical Society, there was one set of underwear that came in where the woman had both open crotch and closed crotch from about 1905. So she could go either way. By 1910, later, closed crotch is the way to go. And eventually everything gets so short, it becomes panties. And then that's about panties as we wear them today is a 1930s concept. However, as far as time of the month, two things that I would like to say about that is, for most women in the 19th century, if they're getting married, they're probably having a lot of children. 6 children is the norm in the 19th century. So you're not having your period as often as you might in modern times. The other thing that someone found is that when pads came out, which is a 1890s invention, I think it's either Godey's Ladies Book or Harper's Bazaar or one of those women's magazines put out an editorial on, you can now buy pads. They're filled with wood shavings to take care of the liquid. But they pointed out that you no longer have to bleed into your chemise. So this, women did not write about or talk about or put in, there's very little about what happened, what women did during their period. It's very rare to find anything written about it. So this is a very interesting statement and makes us wonder if women are pulling up their chemise underneath their, from the back to the front, or and pinning them and having you bleed into your chemise, and not having rags or having some other kind of special catcher for that, for the blood that's coming out. So
wow, makes you feel pretty lucky to be alive.
it's hard to know, but one thing when you read about menstruation at this time period that historians want you to know is that they're not having their period as often because they are having children more often.
That's a very good point. So Mark Ponce is asking, what was the social impression of male corsets and who wore them?
Male corsets are generally worn by military men. However, there is a time period in the 1840s when the men's silhouette had a nipped in waist. And for men who had a bit of a paunch, wearing a male corset was the thing to do. It was considered a little kind of, not quite the thing to do, but it wasn't considered outrageously inappropriate. However, that is really the only time frame that I see men who are outside of the military wearing corsets on any kind of regular basis. Military men want to have that correct bearing, which corsets will give them, and so you might see them wearing it more often.
Wow, very interesting.
There's a cartoon that I have from this era here, showing a military man who may be corseted, but is definitely in tight clothes. And she drops her handkerchief and neither of them can bend down to pick it up. So there is an issue there.
So Dominica Skila is asking, I'm wondering if all corsets were made out of corset coutil.
Corset coutil is sort of the norm. As we move into the late 19th century, and you start getting kind of a sexier look to your underwear, you'll start seeing satins, though they have to be built over kind of a heavy duck or coutil underframe. The other fabric that I've seen a lot in corsets is sateen, which is cotton woven in a satin weave. But coutil is not the only fabric being used. It is the dominant fabric being used, however.
Fascinating. Well, one final question for you, Leslie. So do you think any of these pieces are going to come back at any point? And if so, which one would you like to see most?
Well, I don't know if anything will come back looking like this, but I've kind of tracked over time, in the late in 1980s into the 1990s, I was looking at wedding gowns, and a bustled back wedding gown was the thing in the late 1980s. Doesn't mean you had a bustle on, but you had the extra fabric at the back that gave you a bustled look. Corsets, think Madonna. She took the corset she made it outerwear, which hadn't existed before. So these garments exist still in various ways. However, they're not going to be the norm. I think women have become too used to having comfortable clothing. There are some exceptions with high heels, but that seems to be the last gasp of uncomfortable clothing that women are allowing themselves to be stuck with.
Well, thank goodness for that.
I think a lot of it has to do with whether you're trying to attract a male or not. And in the 19th century, that's very important. I think post-feminist movement, that may not be as important.
Leslie Bellais, thank you so much for joining us today. What a fascinating topic. And we'd love to have you back to talk about specifics of other areas that you're familiar with too, in terms of styles and uncomfortable clothing.
It's always a pleasure. This is my favorite thing to talk about.
Excellent. Well, everybody, please tune in next Tuesday, June 1st. We're going to be talking to Johanna Osterwick on Badger Talks Live. She's the interim director of Allen Centennial Garden, and she's going to be talking about what spring looks like in the garden and some of the teaching and learning happening there, and how you can visit the gardens as well. Please visit badgertalks.wis.edu, where you can see our upcoming schedule of talks. You can sign up for our email list. Please consider a donation to Badger Talks. We are supported by a grant from the Alumni Association. And you can also host your own speaker. If you visit our website, you'll be able to search through a list of about 400 faculty and staff that are signed up to give talks around the state, and you can fill out a request form there. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you next week.